Thanks for watching. This is a Residency and State Financial Aid Updates webinar presented by the Washington Student Achievement Council and is recorded on June 22nd, 2018.
Okay, your hosts for today are me, Gail Wooten. I am the Associate Director of Policy and Planning here at the Student Achievement Council, and I've been working in higher ed up and down the West Coast for about 14 years. And this picture is me back in 1989 when I was just dreaming about being a policy expert in higher ed.
Hi, and I'm your other host, Sarah Weiss. Weiss is nice. Hopefully you remember me that way. I'm an Associate Director here at WASFA, Student Achievement Council, in our College Access and Support Division. My background is also in higher education in Oregon at a public regional university here in Washington at a private campus, and I've been at the council about 3.5 years.
So let's talk more about who the Washington Student Achievement Council is. We are a state agency in Olympia, and our primary goal is to advance educational opportunities and attainment here in Washington State. We have a lot of different things that we work on, but today we're going to focus on residency for in-state tuition as well as state financial aid. More specifically, with residency, one of my roles in policy is to work on the laws and rules that go into who gets in-state tuition and who gets out-of-state tuition. And the reason why we have these laws is to ensure that taxpayer money actually goes toward people who are residents versus people who just move to the state to get in-state to go to college. And the laws are also there to ensure that colleges have the same laws to go off of to be able to make those determinations. And my role is also to help those schools answer questions about determinations for in-state aid.
And another one of the many roles and areas that the Student Achievement Council administers are our state financial aid programs. And we're going to talk specifically about two of those programs today, College Bound Scholarship and State Need Grant, but there are several other state financial aid programs. And we also administer the Washington Application for State Financial Aid, or WASFA, and that is the application that students who are not eligible for federal aid, such as our undocumented students, should apply to be considered for state financial aid. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Okay, so this slide is really just to tell you what the primary purpose of this webinar is today, and that is to make sure you understand that undocumented students are able to get in-state tuition and they're able to get state financial aid here in Washington. The caveats to that is they obviously have to meet residency standards to get in-state tuition, and depending on which residency standards they meet, they might be eligible to get state financial aid if they meet other aid requirements. And when we're talking about undocumented students, we mean basically people who are in the U.S. who don't have a legal status. They don't have proper documentation. And that includes everyone from people who moved here without documentation, including adults and their kids. And a lot of the people you hear about are youth who moved here with their families when they were maybe 2 years old, or a baby, or 6 years old. So a lot of the people we're talking about when we're talking about undocumented students are those folks. But we also are including people who might have moved here with a legal status, like a visa or something along those lines, and then they let the status expire and they still live here. So it's a really diverse group of people, and we just want to make sure you're aware that there's not any one type of undocumented student. So let's talk about how that works. So there's basically two actions and laws that are out there that support undocumented students here in Washington. One is called DACA. That's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. That's actually a federal executive order. It's not a law. It was signed by Obama, and it basically, if a student has DACA, what it means is that person can avoid deportation for a 2-year period, and they can also work during that 2-year period, and people can continue to renew that every 2 years. You may have heard that this was rescinded back in September, but several injunctions have kept it alive, which at this point basically means that people who had DACA or currently have it are still able to reapply, but new people who are meeting the requirements can't apply yet at this time. That could change in a month or two, because there was another injunction that said that they could, but they had to give it some time for the federal government to appeal. So I'm not sure yet if that has happened, but we should know pretty soon if people can apply for a new status, which would basically put DACA back into where it was pre-September. The other law is HB 1079, which is something that a lot of you have probably heard of. This is a Washington-specific law. A lot of other states have laws like this that basically allow certain undocumented students to get in-state tuition. The way the law is written, however, is it doesn't specifically say that someone has to be undocumented. It just says that they have to meet certain requirements, which we'll go over in a few slides. So really, any student can qualify for this. It looks like, with the limited data that we have, that about 80% of people who get in-state tuition through this law are presumed to be undocumented, but another big chunk are actually U.S. citizens or permanent residents, and even people on international student visas can get this if they meet the requirements. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that when we're referring to these students, we try not to call them 1079 students or DACA students. They are students first who happen to have DACA status, or they are students who happen to meet the HB 1079 standards. But the thing to know about these two standards is if students have them or meet them, they quite possibly might be able to get in-state tuition and also meet residency requirements for aid, which we'll go into more here. So let's start with DACA. So we have two residency standards out there for undocumented students. The first is for students who have DACA, and actually a law just passed or just got implemented a couple weeks ago here in Washington, that students who either currently have DACA or even have expired DACA can be reviewed for in-state tuition. So if you have a student who comes to you who has DACA or used to have DACA, basically you run them through the same residency process as any U.S. citizen here in Washington. And you'll see here on the right, there's two primary ways that people in Washington get in-state tuition. There's actually a list of 18 ways, and I'm obviously not going to go over all of those ways for you today, but just know that these are the two primary ways. And the first is for financially independent students and this is actually, keep in mind that this is a different definition than financial aid's definition. It's basically students who are not being claimed on someone's taxes and are paying their own way. If someone's independent, they must maintain a domicile in Washington for 1 year for purposes other than education. And domicile is an entire webinar into and unto itself, so I'm not going to get into that, but the main thing to understand is that the person must show that this is the place where they intend to remain and that they're physically present here. That's basically what domicile is, and they have to show that they've done that for a year prior to starting school. They also can't have moved here and just immediately started going to school. And there's more to that too, and your residency officer on your campus would have that information and help you understand that. The other group of students that's the most common are dependent students. These are students who are being claimed on someone's taxes or aren't paying their own way. And basically they have to have at least one parent or legal guardian who's had that domicile. So independent students, that you have to look at them, dependent students who get their parents. And one thing to note is that undocumented parents can have a Washington domicile. And this is important because you might actually have a U.S. citizen who comes to you and their parents are undocumented. You may or may not know that their parents are undocumented, but if you did know that, Also, you can know that they are eligible to establish a domicile here. So basically, again, these are the two primary ways that someone with DACA, current or expired, could get in-state tuition and also meet the residency requirements for state financial aid. So the next standard is our 1079 standard, and this is more of a checklist. So the student who meets 1079 is someone who has lived in Washington for 36 consecutive months, 3 years, right before earning their high school diploma or the equivalent, so a GED or homeschool, or there's other equivalents out there, but it's mostly going to be a diploma or a GED. If the student got a high school diploma from a Washington school, they have to also complete their full senior year there. After getting the diploma or equivalent, they must continuously reside until they go to college. And then they also sign an affidavit saying, this stuff is true, and I will file a permanent resident application as soon as I'm eligible. The one thing to note about that is that nobody at a school should be looking to see if the student actually filed their permanent resident app, because you have no idea when they would actually be eligible. They may never be eligible, but if they have the intent to file when they can, then they should sign the affidavit. The other thing to point out is that the affidavit is actually on our WASFA, the financial aid application for Washington, and Sarah will talk more about that application. But students who fill that out are also, if they meet this standard, they also can fill out that form. So there is a paper form, but we really encourage you at your institutions for the residency officer and the financial aid officer to work together to make sure students don't have to fill out that form twice. It does happen, and that's okay, but let's try to make this as simple a solution as possible for students. The one other thing about the affidavit is when a student signs this, they're saying this stuff is true. So if you get the affidavit, whether it's through the WASFA or by paper, you're to take that as, great, this student has met this, I'm going to give them in-state tuition. And the only time you would question it is if you see some kind of red flag in their application, like maybe they signed the affidavit, but you know they actually graduated from a high school outside of Washington. Then you can go and look into it. But the takeaway is you shouldn't be double checking. You shouldn't be asking the student to prove that these things are true. So please keep that in mind. And then finally, those are the two standards for undocumented students, and we know that some students might not meet one of these standards, particularly students who don't have DACA and maybe didn't live here 3 years before graduating from high school. So we encourage you to tell those students to think about talking to an immigration attorney, because there may be a status that they actually qualify for that they didn't know about that would allow them to get in-state tuition. So, and when you're doing that, my suggestion would be to start with the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, because they do a lot of this work, and we know that they're a legitimate organization. Unfortunately, there are people out there who might take advantage of these students, so please support your students in any way you can if they aren't able to meet one of these standards. So those are the standards, and now Sarah's going to talk a little bit more about how that relates to financial aid.
Yeah, and so every state financial aid program has essentially two buckets of requirements. One is a state residency requirement, and then there are program requirements. And so we're going to talk about both, but the main point I want to initially make is that there are really two sets of requirements, residency and then program requirements. We're going to focus on the two largest state financial aid programs, starting with College Bound. And the program requirement of College Bound is that students must apply in middle school, and for those eligible students who apply in middle school, complete an application, pledge to graduate from high school, not be convicted of a felony, have at least a 2.0, and if they do that, and are income eligible, meet residency requirements, which I'll talk about in a minute, they would be eligible for essentially the funds to cover with state financial aid the cost of tuition at public rates, some fees plus a small book stipend. And college-bound students must enroll within 1 year of graduating high school, and they have roughly four academic years to use that scholarship within 5 years of graduating high school. Now, there is an income eligibility requirement. Once they graduate from high school and are in college, they must apply every year to verify income eligibility. Now, the state residency requirements for college-bound, this is where there was a change this past legislative session, and it went into effect June 7th of this year. And so in the past, the residency requirements for college-bound and for state need grant were different. In the past, students had to meet a subset of residency requirements that really only allowed undocumented students to be eligible for college-bound residency requirements if they had DACA. Now, that has changed. College-bound now aligns with state need grant. And so for students who meet either of the DACA standard, which includes expired or unexpired, and that's another change this legislative session, the expired portion. Students who have DACA meet the DACA standard. They can also meet the 1079 standard that Gail talked about and be eligible for college-bound residency requirements. So in the past, college-bound had a DACA requirement to meet residency. State need grant had students could meet 1079. They are now aligned in that students can meet either of the residency standards and be eligible for the residency portion of the financial aid programs. And again, they also need to meet the program requirements outlined here for college-bound. I also want to talk about state need grant, as that is actually the largest state financial aid program. As I said, with all state financial aid programs, they must meet residency standards. And again, for state need grant, students can meet that, either undocumented students can meet that either via the DACA standard or the 1079 standard mentioned before. State need grant has an income eligibility requirement. Students can use it at one of over 60 eligible institutions in Washington, same as college-bound. There are over 60 institutions in the state that state financial aid can be used at. The key difference with state need grant from a program perspective is that currently funds are limited. It is not a commitment in the same way that the college-bound scholarship is. So first come, first serve in a lot of ways, and so the earlier that a student who didn't sign up for college-bound or is returning to school, moved here in 9th grade, et cetera, but might be eligible for state need grant, the key is that they apply early because funds are limited. Now, the legislature this past legislative session did add funding to state need grant, which is a fantastic update, and they've also committed to move towards fully funding it. However, again, right now it is not a fully funded program, so apply early. Now, how do students apply for financial aid in general, but specifically undocumented students for programs like college-bound and state need grant? And again, those are only 2 state financial aid programs. There are others that have residency and program requirements, but those are the 2 largest. We talk about the rule of 1, in that students should only do either the FAFSA or the WASFA. And so students who are eligible to apply for the FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid, so students who are citizens or have permanent residence status, quote, green card, may be eligible for federal aid, they should apply for financial aid using the FAFSA. That will also allow them to be considered for state financial aid that they may be eligible for. They do not have to do both applications. Rule of 1. They can access that via FAFSA.gov. Just a reminder, there are sites out there that try to offer assistance and charge to file the FAFSA. Always encourage folks to remember what the first word in the FAFSA is, free, so students should not have to pay for that. So again, students who are eligible for federal aid should apply for financial aid using the FAFSA, and that will also allow them to be considered for state aid. Here in Washington, because students, we have those residency requirements that students who are non-citizens could meet the residency requirements for state financial aid programs. We also have what's called the WASFA, the Washington Application for State Financial Aid. This is administered by the Student Achievement Council, as I said earlier, and is for students who may be eligible for state programs, such as College Bound, State Need Grant, as two examples, but can't do the FAFSA due to immigration status. So there needs to be an application for them to apply, to be considered, have those income elements checked, etc., and that is via the WASFA. It's available at readysetgrad.org/WASFA. And again, every student should only do one application, the FAFSA or the WASFA. A really helpful tip that I like to share when working with schools or districts or events that might be doing like a financial aid completion event. And we encourage students or schools, and I'm sure many of you are also thinking about this. You don't want to ask students point blank, oh, which application should you be filling out? You don't want to put them on the spot like that, as there can be sensitivity to identifying that way. So on a recommendation is on the readysetgrad.org/WASFA site, there is a questionnaire that asks 3 or 4 questions. It helps students figure out which application they should use, the FAFSA or the WASFA. And so that can be a really handy tool in, if you're doing a financial aid assistance night and you've got a computer lab, just have that questionnaire up and allow students to kind of walk through it, and it'll help determine which application they should complete. If they need to be doing the FAFSA, it'll kick them over to the FAFSA site. If they need to be doing the WASFA, it'll walk them through that process as well. So something that we are often asked is, especially around data in general here at the Student Achievement Council, but especially around data regarding undocumented students, because it does have, brings a lot of anxiety for a lot of folks, is we have on the readysetgrad.org/WASFA site this privacy statement. And everyone loves a slide full of words, but I wanted to put the privacy statement up there and highlight these 2 specific sections. That by state law, the purpose of the WASFA is to have a mechanism for colleges and universities that offer state financial aid to be able to determine if a student is eligible. That is the explicit legal purpose of it. Campuses are not permitted to use that information for any other purpose or allowed to share that data with anyone else. Last year, the State Attorney General's office issued guidance to state agencies on what to do if a state agency is brought a federal subpoena or a federal order, and that is to contact the Attorney General's office and to not simply disclose that information. And so there are protections put around this privacy, and the WASFA is an application that's administered here in Olympia. Students call and ask questions about their application. They're calling the Student Achievement Council offices. And so, again, we shouldn't be telling students not to worry about if they fill something out or not, because everybody's situation is different. But I do encourage folks to point out the privacy statement and specifically these 2 items within it, and the Attorney General's guidance, which is posted on the WASFA site as well. And I like to also show some numbers in terms of the numbers of students who receive funding via State Need Grant and College Bound. As I said, these are the 2 largest state financial aid programs. The WASFA was implemented in 2014, and so you can see that that's when that data start. But you can kind of just get a sense, and these are the specific numbers circled there, of students who've received State Need Grant or College Bound funding via the WASFA application. With the alignment of residency requirements for College Bound and State Need Grant, I would imagine that we would see some increases in these over the next few years, provided, again, those students meet the program requirements for either of the programs.
And finally, this is our information. So if you have any questions, we're always happy to help. We know this is some complicated stuff, and this is a lot of new information this year, but we actually think it's going to make things a lot easier for all of our students to understand what requirements they meet and what resources they can now get from the state. So thank you for joining us, and that's the end of our webinar. Thank you so much.